Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and it's wonderful to see so many of you here. This is meant to be a library event, but we've now moved to the chamber because so many of you are enthusiastic and eager about this topic, and it's really wonderful to see so much interest in what we're going to discuss tonight. Tonight's guest needs very little introduction to many of you here in the chamber. In 2020, Mr. Philippe Lazzarini was appointed Under Secretary General of the United Nations and Commissioner General of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East. Prior to his appointment in UNRWA, Mr. Lazzarini served from August 2015 as a Deputy UN Special Coordinator and as a Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator for Lebanon. Mr. Lazzarini has over 30 years of professional experience, including in leadership positions within the UN, the private sector, and the International Committee of the Red Cross, and has extensive experience in humanitarian assistance and international coordination in conflict and post-conflict areas. Would you please join me in giving him a warm union welcome? I'd like to start off by saying a warm thank you for joining us here. Welcome to Cambridge and welcome to the Union. I hear this is your first time, and I hope that it certainly won't be the last. I think there's so many places for us to start, but let's start here. There was a piece that's recently been published in The Guardian, which I read, which came out very recently. And in this article, you wrote the following. You wrote, "Rebuilding Gaza means restoring governance, justice, and the broadly held conviction that peace is still possible within the parameters of the two-state solution." Whilst the promise of a two-state solution has been lauded by many political activists and world leaders, certain right-wing Israeli party officials from parties such as Likud have disavowed the promise and reality of a two-state solution. Amidst the controversy and the uncertainty that the two-state solution is facing, particularly in this new chapter of the conflict, what gives you so much faith that it still remains possible?
So, first of all, thank you, Ivan, and colleagues, very glad to be here. It's the first time I interact with this kind of audience, so definitely a pleasure for me. I think you raise an important question about the two-state solution. The two-state solution, let's say, before October 7, 2023, for almost 10 years, the solution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict was not prioritized by the international community. It was relegated. And I think at that time, no one believed anymore in the two-state solution, but we kept it alive because there was absolutely no alternative. But what is also sure, after what we have seen in October 2023, is that there is no way that the longest unresolved conflict remains without a political solution. And if we talk today about a political solution, primarily we think in terms of the right of self-determination of the Palestinians. They have the right to decide what their future will be. Will their future be in a two-state solution, or will the future be under, I would say, a different type of future governance? But again, if we are not addressing the fundamental of this conflict, we take the risk of future relapse. Look at the insanity of what happened since 2005 with Gaza. Gaza under siege. There have been 4 to 5 rounds of conflict. It was a policy of pure containment, absolutely not addressing the fundamental. So after what I would say this almost seismic earthquake since October 2023 in the region, I really hope that this will trigger the wakening up of an international community saying we cannot afford anymore not to genuinely invest in a future political solution. For the time being, the best on the table remain the two-state solution. And that's the reason why also we have to be careful in the future on how we deal with Gaza. We have to be careful not to separate Gaza from the West Bank. It has to remain within the framework of the future Palestinian Authority, because otherwise we take the risk of creating parallel government, two governments, one in Gaza, one in the West Bank, and that brings us back to a different type of scenario.
I think a number of states share your conclusion about the importance and the immediacy of working on a two-state solution. We've seen a number of world leaders like Starmer from Britain and Macron from France share that sentiment and have expedited and initiated processes of recognizing Palestinian statehood. But the numbers and the story in the UN General Assembly show slightly different pictures. Overall, broadly, as you said, in UN Resolution ES 1023, you see 143 states vote in favor of making Palestine an observer state. You have 9 states vote against and 25 abstentions. One of those states that voted against this resolution of making Palestine an observer state, famously, is the US. Whilst I'm sure it is the case that a number of states do share the belief that you do, that now is certainly the time for a two-state solution and to move forward in recognizing it. Are you stalled at all by some of the big power brokers in the international system showing hesitancy?
You know, we have never ever been so far away from a two-state solution. But the question is, what else? What do we want to put on the table? So I think none of the states, at least, is ready to say we have buried the idea of a two-state solution. I also believe, going back to the question about what the member states want, what we want ultimately is, beside providing the right of self-determination to the Palestinians, we want normalization in the Middle East. We want integration in the Middle East. But for this to happen, you need equal partners, countries who cooperate not only in economic growth, but also for their respective security. We have to feel secure enough and confident enough with all our partners. And I truly believe that countries in the region have some leverage to help this happen. The question always is, who has the influence, the will and the influence? For a long time, the will was not here. So the influence is not really used. We have seen, even over the last 2 years, Europe has used almost none of its toolkit, which would have allowed to, try to influence the course of the event on the ground. It hasn't happened. But again, going back to the question of the two-state solution, of course, some would argue that there is no appetite. If you look at the Israeli society, the majority does not necessarily want a two-state solution. If you look at the vote at the Knesset, the majority of the lawmakers have been very clear, we do not want a two-state solution, and the current government does not want a two-state solution. But there is no alternative being offered for the time being, because on one hand, they do not want a two-state solution, but they do not want a one-state solution. So if you want neither a two-state or one state, what is the lasting future solution? So I still believe that the fact that recently additional European countries have decided to recognize the state of Palestine, the main objective was to say we want to keep the idea of the two-state solution alive, but that also means we will have to invest more political capital in the future to make it happen.
On the topic of the two-state solution, I just want to return back to that Guardian article that you wrote. One of the things that I thought was most striking about it was the moment in which you recognized the precarious nature of the ceasefire and also recognizing some of the existing infractions against it. In the post-ceasefire period that we're living in, there seems to be a really strong sense of doubt about the two-state solution materializing, given how many infractions have occurred. I mean, just for reference, since the ceasefire, Israeli forces have committed 52 shootings, 200 killed, over 297 children, a number of mass shellings, consistent targeting of public services. We've spoken a little bit about what's happening on the international level, but in terms of the changing tides within what's going on in Israel, in recognizing this and keeping the energy of the ceasefire strong, how is it that we continue to make sure that all of the international partners are making sure that they're keeping in the spirit of preserving the two-state solution? Because without cessation of violence, that would appear to be difficult.
You know, some say that we have a ceasefire just in name, meaning that it's almost an artificial ceasefire because of what you just said. Now, first, we should never forget that the two main parties on this ceasefire were not the one who have triggered the ceasefire. It was a ceasefire which somehow has been imposed on them. Hence, the importance of the role of the guarantor. Because then you have a roadmap. We want a ceasefire, and then we go in phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. We are still in phase 1. Phase 1, what did he say? The phase 1 says we want the return of all the hostages, alive or dead, and at the same time, we want to significantly scale up the humanitarian response. That's only phase 1. Even phase 1 is not yet fully met. Not all the bodies of the hostages have been brought back, and we are far from what we would have expected in terms of humanitarian assistance. Now, everyone recognizes that it is so fragile that we need to invest more political capital. And there are now discussions going on about a possible future UN Security Council resolution which would lay down the ground for a stabilization force, but beyond that also lay down the ground for reshaping the future governance of Gaza. And it is in this framework that an organization like ours is also saying, but we need also to meet the expectation of the people on the ground, and their expectation are how do we address their basic needs.
Mm-hmm. I just want to go back to the prior statement that you raised, which is about the fact of realizing the importance of international allies, particularly regional allies such as the Saudi Arabians, but also the Egyptians, in helping negotiate the deal. The question then has to be raised of if we're putting so much hope and trust in international regional partners in securing the ceasefire deal, but also mediating between forces, surely at one point there has to be a shift between what we expect international partners to do and for that consensus to start settling within the two parties involved in the conflict. Some critics would turn around and say, well, we are far from that. Sure, you have the international regional consensus built, but having the consensus distilled between those two parties to make sure the ceasefire holds is proving to be much more difficult. In restoring that, is it a case in which we still put hope in international regional partners to fortify that consensus within the countries themselves when parties are showing hesitancy to adopt it?
The weeks and months to come will start to answer this question. I believe that you cannot find a proper pathway to consolidating the ceasefire, starting the early recovery, you cannot find a proper pathway without engaging right from the beginning the Palestinian and the Palestinian Authority. And there is a lot of discussion around this. There is a discussion when we negotiate now the Security Council resolution about when will the Palestinian Authority be ready to come into Gaza or to take over. And for the time being, part of the language is to say, once you have reformed, without saying what kind of reform is properly being expected. The regional countries are very clear, saying we cannot be involved in anything, including stabilization, if right from the beginning the Palestinian Authority are not involved. And I think the way this question will be addressed in the coming weeks will basically tell us the direction of travel. This issue has not been addressed yet. We know that we have different positions as a starting point, depending on to whom did talk to, but it has not yet been addressed. The regional power make it a precondition for the time being to make sure that there is an involvement of Palestinian Authority and that Gaza does not become an international kind of a trustee.
Let's shift gears a little bit. So 3 weeks ago, the ICJ ruled that Israel has a clear legal obligation to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip, particularly to Palestinian civilians in the wake of what many experts have started to call a mass starvation. Despite Israel referring to the ICJ's ruling as political, with the result of its decision-making body in terms of both Palestinian parliamentarians and senior political figures cracking down on UNRWA's humanitarian functions amid the existing UNRWA ban, do you fear for the increased politicization of UN agencies amid the worsening conflict in the Middle East?
First, the International Court of Justice advisory opinion is an important one. It's an important one because it will set the reference within the international community. Now, this ruling has been very clear. There is an obligation of the State of Israel to ensure full humanitarian access to the West Bank and to Gaza. There was also previous ruling saying that, careful, during the war, we had a submission from some member states asking, are we dealing, yes or not, with a situation of a genocide? Make sure that full access be given. So you have few, rulings calling for. Now, it is true that UN organizations have been under assault, that the multilateral system in the context of Gaza has been under assault, and it is also true that international law and international humanitarian law has been blatantly disregarded. There is, and I also do believe that we cannot deal with Gaza in a vacuum and in isolation. There is a very strong feeling in the region, but more broadly in the global south, that international law, international humanitarian law is being implemented as a double standard. It becomes the rule of the stronger, that it is losing its universality. And there is a great danger here, absolutely. That means the entire, I would say, instrument which is the legacy of World War II, is now being questioned and under duress.
I think going back to what you were saying about what is facts and international ruling, I think that one of the things that UNRWA is facing alongside many other UN agencies is this cycle of constant contestation over the facts and over the nature of international law. So, for instance, Israel has rejected the Famine Declaration, insisting that it's completing its due duties and supporting aid reception to the West Bank. Do you feel that, I mean, it's a cycle as old as time. There is a clear international consensus. There is a clear consensus by non-partisan, non-political bodies that's raised. The facts are made. The facts are then contested. At a point, do you think that there is a responsibility on the international community writ large to essentially force the facts to be considered rather than going around this constant loop of contestation from Israel and other states that will contest things like genocide or like mass starvation?
You know, there have been a war of narrative. We should never forget how polarizing, divisive this conflict is and has been. We should also never ever underestimate what the impact of October 7 has been on the Israeli society. But we should never ever underestimate the impact of the systematic destruction of an entire society in Gaza. Now, I believe, yes, the international community has been far too silent. And ultimately, silence is also complicity. The international community has not stood up the way we might have stood up in other situations. What the most striking here is that the difference between what happened in Gaza and previous situation of atrocity is that this has been a war under our watch 24 hours a day in social media. No one can say we didn't know. Now, yes, there have been different narrative which has been relayed. And this war has also been, after that, a war of narrative. As you said, you have the world expert saying that hunger is deepening, starvation is spreading, famine might happen, and they say it has happened for 1/4 of the population. But despite that, experts are disregarded, and you promote a different narrative. The same way, going back to what you said before the ruling of the ICJ, we heard whatever the ICJ say because it was expected what they would rule, it's completely politicized, which is a way to decredibilize and delegitimize institutions which have been built up by a common belief that we need it to promote peace and security.
Turning to UNRWA's work on education, UNRWA has worked for 75 years, and so we had a conversation about this figure as to how long you count the work that's been happening. But UNRWA has been working for at least 75 years in supporting Palestinian refugee children, particularly with educating over 46,000 students in the West Bank. As the conflict emerges into a new chapter, how do you feel like UNRWA can rework, particularly its educational model for children who've been displaced and have had their education disrupted throughout the conflict?
I believe that education, well, first, education is the only thing which has never been taken away from the Palestinians. Palestinians have been dispossessed from the land, houses, but education has always been their pride. And look at the level of literacy among the Palestinians, it's the highest in the region. We had in Gaza, in the UNRWA school, 300,000 girls and boys. We were the first one, by the way, having reached gender parity a long time ago. Now, if you look at the people who were in our school and in other schools, you have about 700,000 girls and boys of the age of primary school and secondary school, deeply traumatized, living in the rubble who have already lost 2 years of school, and before that had also almost lost a full year because of the COVID. Now the question is, what is their future? Is their future education the brutality of the trauma in which they are living in today? Or do we consider bringing them back to a learning environment as much of a priority than to address any other critical need people have? Mm-hmm. I believe education has to be addressed as a matter of urgency. And this is exactly what we have started to do. Since 2 weeks, we have resumed in-person learning space. We have already 40,000 kids who have come back. We aim at 100,000 by the end of the month, and this will be supported after that with some basic online training.
UNRWA schools don't just offer crucial refugee care services to Palestinian refugees, particularly as it relates to children in schooling in Gaza Strip and the West Bank, but also in other affected areas such as Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. Particularly noticing how, particularly as of last year, the conflict started to spread into other states. How has UNRWA dealt with the pressure of having to address things like education as it is spread across the region, in particular instances like Lebanon?
Well, unfortunately, we have a long experience because there have been many wars in the region. Look at the brutal war in Syria over the last 12, 13 years. And this has pushed an agency like ours to do education in emergency setting. After that, we have also developed education on the COVID for more than a year. Trying to reach out the kids through the system available, including the WhatsApp one. So I would say, and we had also the war in southern Lebanon, we have across the region 30,000 staff. They are civil servant-like working for the organization. For those who are not familiar, the organization I'm heading is providing public-like services to one of the most destitute communities across the region, and we function for them like a Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health, and Ministry of Social Services, for example.
Part of the criticism UNRWA has experienced during, we were having this conversation about politicization and what is and isn't politicized, and education, particularly UNRWA schools, have been the face of a lot of politicization, particularly from Israeli propaganda sources. Some of the allegations include the fact that UNRWA has allegedly been accused of being functioning as sites of radicalization, where anti-Semitic content is heavily promoted. How do you feel like these allegations from Israeli propaganda sites are endangering the education mission at the heart of UNRWA and its schooling program?
I think it's important to understand a few elements. First, the politicization. Why is the agency under attack? The agency is primarily under attack because it promotes the right of the Palestinian refugees. Now, there is a belief that the agency perpetuates the refugee status of the Palestinian, and through this, the right of return. Now, if today we still have Palestinian refugees, it's only because the conflict has not been resolved. Because the issue of the right of return is an issue to be resolved politically. It hasn't been resolved. Now, when it comes to education, going back to the region where you have, it's a region in conflict for decades. You have different narrative. There is absolutely no way that an agency like ours can reconcile two completely opposite narratives. You have an Israeli narrative, you have a Palestinian narrative. Our aim is not to try to reconcile. Our aim is to make sure that whatever is being taught in our school is in line with United Nations principle and UNESCO standard. We have criticism coming from some corner in Israel, but I have criticism also from Hamas. We are the one who have promoted gender equality. We are promoting the notion of gender. These are issues that organizations like Hamas in this part of the world do not want to hear, and they accuse us of promoting Western value. So we are always looking at 3 criteria when we have a curriculum coming from the host country, by the way. First is the age appropriateness, the gender perception, and also to make sure that there is no promotion of racism, anti-Semitism, bigotry, or apology of violence.
I think based on what you're saying about politicization, I think one of the fears that has come up a lot since this conflict has been ongoing is the issue of disinformation and misinformation. Not too long ago, actually I have the date here, October 12th, Israeli state officials from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs had taken parts of your own speech out of context to claim that you had alleged that Gaza wasn't currently experiencing a famine. The bit of the speech that they had pulled from was a speech in which you were explaining that UNRWA did have enough food for the Gazan population on the other side of the humanitarian blockade, but had been kept from distributing that. Given that so many people, especially young people, are consuming information on social media, reading through a number of different journals and newspapers, but part of the anxiety about this is how much of this information is legitimate and how much can purposeful disinformation, but also accidental misinformation, get in the way of the important work that's being done by agencies like UNRWA.
We have fought back disinformation from day one. We have been a constant target of disinformation. There have been tens of millions of dollars being invested to target organizations like ours in terms of information or disinformation campaign. What you have to do is constantly debunk, debunk, debunk. Now, for an audience like here, the question is always, what source of information are you trusting or not trusting? My advice is, don't trust one source. Triangulate your information. And when something sounds a little bit strange, there are ways to go back to find out what is the origin. Sometimes we have the belief that because an information is conveyed by 10 different platforms, that means information is correct. But when you look at the source, it's always the same source. One source of information with the aim of making you believe or twisting a reality. But disinformation has been part of this war of narrative, and I don't think it is unique to this conflict, unfortunately. We see it also in the context of Russia-Ukraine, but we see it in context of domestic politics. Whenever you have election going on, the issue of disinformation has become a new plague, I believe.
That's the last question from me. Thank you very much.